Watts. I'm a lecturer in television and creative industries at the University of Manchester. Very excited to be chairing the first of two panels today on fans. Elke will be back at 3 o'clock, I believe, with a panel on fan curation and online TV. But first, we're looking here at fan behaviour online. It's quite an interdisciplinary panel today, which I hope will be useful in thinking about these outliers of television that we've been discussing in the conference. So as always, I'll introduce the panelists one by one before they speak, and we'll have space for questions at the end after the three 20-minute papers. For the speakers, I will bob my head up when you have 2 minutes left and give you a little warning to stay within the 20 minutes we have. But yeah, we'll have time for questions at the end. So do everyone else please note things down. Feel free to use the chat box or raise your hand as you will have been doing throughout the conference. So everyone, if we, apart from the speaker, we'll turn our cameras off to save on the bandwidth. We've had a few Teams gremlins already this afternoon, so hopefully that isn't too problematic. But other than that, yes, I think we're ready to go. So first up, we have Dr. Cody T. Havard, who is Professor of Sport Commerce, Director of Research and Director of the Bureau of Sport and Leisure Commerce in the Kemmons Wilson School at the University of Memphis. Cody's research focuses on the rivalry phenomenon to better understand group member behaviour and its impact on society. So whenever you're ready, Cody, over to you. And you, if you could just knock your camera off as well and your mic while Cody's speaking.
All right. Can everyone see the slides?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you for having me today. As you said, this is a interdisciplinary panel. I'm very interdisciplinary, I guess, because my background is I am a sport marketer, and I research sport marketing. I teach sport marketing in our sport commerce program. And over the last 4 or 5 years, I've started to dive more into general entertainment and different types of settings. So what my primary line of research is the rivalry phenomenon, and it is basically why groups, whatever they may be, why somebody chooses to treat someone differently based on their group identification. Obviously, I started in sport and started in college sport, looking at rival fans and how they interact with each other and interact with their teams. But as I said, over the last 4 or 5 years, I've started to look outside of just sport into more general entertainment and group settings. And so that's what brings me here today. This is a paper that we did where we compared group identity and rivalry, feelings of rivalry, and likely behaviors between people who were fans of sport and people who considered themselves fans of direct-to-consumer streaming services. And so, let me see if there we go. What we know from our research into rivalry and group behavior is that social identity influences a lot of what we do. It influences how we see ourselves, but also influences the groups we join. And it influences the groups we join because we want it to say something positive about ourselves, and we want other people to view ourselves in positive ways because of our group identity. Now, where rivalry comes into play is when we are a member of a group, we commonly interact with another group and members of that group. And that's in a competitive situation. That goes back to really the beginning of research on the beginning of man, as far as battling over resources and competing over being able to stay alive and things like that. But what happens as group members is we start to view group membership differently. So we will view our group more positively than the out group. And that also influences how we behave toward that group, how we perceive our in group and our out group. It influences things like situational assessment. If we see something negative, we associate that, or I'm sorry, we stereotype that to the out group. If we see something positive, we stereotype that to the in group, and say everybody in the in group does that. And then also, as I mentioned, where I got my start was looking at the marketing and product engagement outcomes of this and the ramifications and implications of that. So as far as a background for this particular study, here is kind of a definition of what rivalry is. It forms when two competing groups elevate each in perceived importance, and they view each other as a threat to their in-group and also to themselves, and their identity that they're able to feel and public image they're able to show others. So rivalry can increase consumption, which is a really good thing if you're an organization, and you see that all the time in the way people will promote their products and engage with consumers. But it also increases derogation or negativity between groups. So things like likelihood to celebrate failure by an outgroup. This is Schadenfreude and glory out of reflective failure, which glory out of reflective failure is an extension of the competitive extension of Schadenfreude when a rival group is present. It can also influence us to have the win at all cost mentality. So maybe be a little unethical when making decisions and trying to best a rival or an outgroup. And then to me, most striking is this likelihood to consider anonymous aggression toward outgroup members. And we've done this over many studies where we've asked people how likely would they be to consider different types of aggression toward outgroup members. And we've asked things like trip somebody, break somebody's leg. And sometimes we say physically hurt someone, but there have been times where in the studies, it actually has asked somebody, how likely would you be to consider murdering someone from the outgroup? And alarmingly, throughout all of those studies, about 5 or 6 that have been published, we have found 1% to 2% of people have said they would definitely be willing, a 7 out of 7 on a scale, definitely be willing to consider the most heinous act of aggression toward an outgroup member. So that's really important because as a marketer, you have to kind of play down to that denominator, right? Most people know that rivalries and competitions are just that, and they're good for consumers. But we have that 1% to 2% of people in both groups that may see those calls or those promotions as a call to action, which we unfortunately have seen around the world in sport and outside of sport, and we have seen in this country, the United States, several times. So what we did in this study is here are all the comparisons that we've made, and looking at how people perceive their group and their out group. And we've done these comparisons, and all the studies involve sport, but we've done sport and politics, and then you can go down the list: online gaming consoles such as people who play on Xbox or PlayStation, Apple, Samsung phone users, Star Wars, Star Trek fans, Marvel, DC Comics fans. We started with Disney parks fans and how they viewed the Disney parks and Universal parks, and then we expanded that onto theme parks in general. And then most recently, actually, we've just completed a paper on athletic shoe brands, Nike and Adidas. So this, and looking at direct-to-consumer streaming brands, adds to these comparisons. So there's 11 in all, and we'll get to that a little bit later. Here's what we did. We had 3 hypotheses. The first hypothesis, based on previous research, because it is a consumer product, we felt sport fans would report more negativity toward their rival group than would streaming fans. And then to test the common in-group theory, we tested people who were only sport fans versus people who identified as both sport and streaming fans. and hypothesis 2. And then hypothesis 3, we just flipped that and we tested people who consider themselves fans of streaming versus people who consider themselves fans of both sport and streaming. And so in the study, we had a sample size of 117, and you could see the demographic breakdown as far as gender and age. As far as fandom, the first question we always ask in these studies is, are you a fan of sport? Are you a fan of the non-sport products or categories? So in this case, streaming, or are you a fan of both? And here's how it broke down. 38.5% of respondents said they were fans of sport, 31.6% said they were fans of streaming, and 29.9% said they were fans of both. Now, specific to streaming, we asked people to identify their favorite and their rival streaming brands, because sport fans are asked that as well. And basically, that's used so that throughout the rest of the survey, your favorite team is piped into questions where it's dealing with your favorite team, and the rival team is piped in to where it's questions dealing with the rival team. Same thing with the streaming. So you would see your favorite streaming brand piped in where necessary, and your rival streaming brand piped in where necessary. So when asked about favorite brands, the top 3, I think, come as no surprise if you look at market share and number of subscribers for these streaming services. 48.6% of participants said Netflix was their favorite, followed by Amazon Prime and Disney Plus. And there's a pretty big drop from Netflix to Amazon Prime. And I think that goes along with the market share that Netflix currently has. And I will say this study was conducted before the most recent kind of downturn in subscribers. I'm sure people, it's been well documented, the number of subscribers that Netflix lost and so on. But also with the rival brands, it's much the same, except Amazon Prime is actually first. And I think that comes because people have Amazon Prime Video, because a lot of people have Amazon and Amazon Prime. So 34.7% said Amazon Prime, followed by Netflix at 22.2%, and then Disney at 16.7%. I did want to point out in the favorite and rival brands that there are actually 2 brands in each category that are controlled or owned by Disney. So if you put those together, Disney Plus and Hulu for the favorite brand, it would have been 18.7% for Disney-owned properties. So it actually would have been higher than Amazon Prime. And if you would have put Disney Plus and Hulu together, it actually would have been, for the rival brand, it would have been 29.2%. So that would have been slightly above the Netflix numbers. So in our method, we looked at identification, attitudes toward your favorite brand, and then rival perception. So for identification, we use a revised version of what we use in our field, the sport spectator identification scale, but it has been used outside of sport many times, and it's a very reliable measure of how identified a person is with a favorite brand. To measure favorite brand attitude, we actually used a 5-item semantic differential scale developed by Spears and Singh that asks people 5 questions, how and it properly gauges their attitude toward their favorite brand. Now, for rival perceptions, people were also asked those attitude questions toward the rival brand. And in addition to that, they were asked to complete 12 items from 4 different facets that come from the rivalry perception scale. Now, the rivalry perception scale provides a rounded view of how people perceive their rivals through things like direct competition, how much satisfaction does a person receive when the rival brand experiences some type of failure, that or how likely would they be to celebrate if their favorite brand was successful in direct competition? How likely would they be to support the rival in indirect competition? But it also measures perceived prestige of the rival brand, and also fan behavior from rival brand supporters. The glory out of reflective scale, the reflective failure scale, is that scale that measures how likely would you be to celebrate an indirect failure by the rival team. And then all of that together, we put those 16 items together to form the group behavior composite, which is an overall view of derogation and negativity across different sectors, which we'll get to at the end of this. And as you can see, our scales, all scales used, showed strong, acceptable reliability. So in hypothesis 1, sport versus streaming fandom, we had, there we go, yeah, and I apologize for it saying theme park. There were significant differences in identification and sense of satisfaction. In both of those situations, fans of sport were reported higher means. So that means they were more identified with their favorite brand. They also reported that they would experience more satisfaction if their favorite brand compared favorably to their rival brand. So in this case, their favorite sport team beats their rival sport team. Now, with hypothesis 2 and 3, to test that common in-group hypothesis, there were significant differences with sport versus fans who were fans of sport and streaming. And that was an attitude toward favorite brand. So people who were fans of only a sport team reported more positive attitudes toward their favorite team than people who reported as fans of both a sport team and streaming fandom. And then also higher outgroup support. So sport was actually fans of sport actually reported higher likelihood of supporting their rival team in indirect competition than did streaming fans supporting a rival brand when their favorite brand isn't included. Now, for hypothesis 3, streaming fans versus fans of both streaming and sport, fans that were, or people who were fans of both streaming and sport reported higher attitude toward their favorite brand, and then also a higher attitude, or I'm sorry, a more negative attitude toward their rival brand. So in this case, being a fan of only streaming caused people to be more negative toward their rival brand than if you were a fan of both sport and streaming, which supports the common in-group hypothesis that says if we are members of multiple groups, then when our favorite group experiences failure, some type of failure, we don't experience the negativity as much for that because we have other interests that we can throw ourselves into. So therefore, we are less negative toward people from those groups as well. Now, as I mentioned with the group behavior composite, when we developed that, and we developed it in mind of creating a hierarchy and also a spectrum for practitioners and future researchers to keep up with this. So here's the hierarchy of outgroup derogation. So what we see is in our 11 settings that we have completed so far or studied so far, the most negative, so in that highly negative group, the most negative setting is actually online gaming. Those are people who compete using a PC or online, a computer, or versus people who compete using some type of gaming console. They view each other more negatively, even than people in United States politics who view each other as either a Republican or a Democrat supporting supporter. Sorry. And then sport fandom is the third highest, where we see this is we're at number 6 with streaming, and that would be labeled a medium negative. And it'll make a little bit more sense when we see the spectrum and see how kind of close a lot of these things are. But you could see from highly negative to low negativity where these fall on the hierarchy. And then when we get to the spectrum, and this spectrum is kind of zoomed in to 3.5 to 5 because that's one where everything has fallen. But it is a spectrum from 1 meaning least negative to 7 meaning most negative. And you could see where everything lies on here. So you see with online electronic gaming being the highest because it has a mean of 4.78. Politics 4.75, sport 4.49. So anything above that 4.0 mark is, neutral to slightly negative views of the rival group. So as you look at online gaming and politics, they're far above even sport in the amount of negativity that is displayed or reported amongst outgroup members. Now, specific to this study, if you look at streaming, it actually has the same mean as theme park fandom. So somebody who's a fan of Six Flags and their view on Disney or Universal or Dollywood is about the same as somebody who's a fan of Disney Plus and their view on Amazon Prime or Netflix, whoever they consider their rival brand. And then I do want to point out with science fiction fandom and comics fandom, those are the only two settings that are actually below that 4.0 neutral mark. So with those two, we actually could say that they have slightly positive views of their outgroup, which is really interesting when you think about comics and science fiction. Those are both kind of categories where you have a lot of like competition and thank you, Robert. Competition and like battle and everything that's highlighted. However, people in those groups kind of form this more cohesive in group, because no matter if you are a fan of DC or Marvel, or a fan of Star Wars or Star Trek, you're a fan of those categories and those properties. And also you've probably been told more than once that maybe that's not the correct fandom you should have. And then in conclusion, when we look at market share, I think it's important to look at the top, the favorite brands and rival brands. As I said, they were all Amazon Prime, Netflix, and Disney were all the top three in either favorite or rival. But then, as I mentioned, if you look at the Disney-owned brands of Disney Plus and Hulu, when we look at the hierarchy and the spectrum, that could be used for teaching group behavior, for people to associate with somebody else and focus on something possibly more positive. And then for future, looking for commonalities, more of these studies, and then actually to start to test the common in-group on perceptions and behaviors that people have. And so with that, that is my presentation, and I thank you everybody for having me.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Cody. And we'll have, as I say, if you have questions, we'll come to them all at the end after everybody's had a chance to speak. Next up, we have Kateryna Sivak, who is a full-time doctoral researcher in media and cultural studies at Birmingham City Institute of Media and English. Her PhD project explores varying practices within the Ukrainian informal screen media economy that in one way or another make films and TV series accessible to the Ukrainian audience. She's a co-editor of Makings, an open access journal on the cultural and creative industries as well. So right, I will hand over to you, Kateryna.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Cody, for such an interesting and insightful presentation as well. Can't wait for the Q&A. Right, so I hope everyone can see my screen. I assume that's a yes.
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 Thank you. Right, so the paper that I'm presenting today, it is based on my PhD project. My PhD project is an ethnographic study of various practices that are related to localization and distribution of mainstream film and TV content in Ukraine. I'm specifically interested in the practices that exist outside of the official regulated spaces, practices that can be defined as informal if we follow the informal media economy framework of Ramon Lobato and Julian Thomas. Because of the informal nature, sorry?
Almost ready?
Sorry, I think someone's unmuted. Because of the informal nature of the practices that I study, they tend to be viewed as marginal. They tend to be seen as a supplement to or an imitation of their formal counterparts. And what's the most limiting part is that they're primarily associated with amateurism. And this in turn can leave us questioning the quality levels that an informal practice can achieve in formal localization, AVT practice. And it can discourage one from exploring all the complexities that almost inevitably exist behind such a practice. However, as my research aims to illustrate, such views are quite limiting because they only apply to some of the informal media activities. And today, by focusing on several cases of Ukrainian informal subtitling and voiceover practices. What I essentially want to demonstrate is how complex and how important informal activities can be in the markets such as Ukraine. But before I move on to the specific cases, what I would like to address first is where these informal AVT practices sit in relation to the more researched formal space, particularly in relation to the global streaming services that seem to dominate the global content distribution. So such services as Netflix, they promote their content libraries as available in almost every country around the world. And they arguably disrupt global distribution trends by making wider variety of content accessible to the broader audience. But we have an increasing number of scholars who remind us of the local realities that need to be accommodated for this audiovisual content to become truly accessible for a certain audience. And these realities include varying willingness and ability to pay for TV content, unequal internet access, which remains a problem in many countries, both in terms of the cost that one can afford to spend on the sufficiently high-speed internet to handle and accommodate streaming, as well as uneven internet coverage of different areas in the country. We also have hindrances to viewing that are related to geo-blocking, which means that titles that are advertised as global are actually only available in a limited number of countries. And the aspect that I'm focusing on today is language. We shouldn't forget that this is one of the main barriers when it comes to international accessibility of television. Even if you're happy to pay the subscription fee, if you have good internet connection, if the series that you want to watch, they are available in your region's Netflix library, all this is to no avail unless you can understand the language that the series is in, or if you're provided with translation. And Ukraine serves as a good example of how difficult it can be to secure this translation. At its core, translation is an additional expense for a content distributor and producer. For translation into more widely spoken languages such as English or Spanish, this expense it is relatively easy to justify because of the size of the paying audience that this translation caters to. But when it comes to Ukrainian language market, for a complex set of reasons that deserve a separate paper, Ukrainian language market remains to be seen as economically insignificant. And for the purposes of today's discussion, the bottom line is that both global and Ukrainian distributors, they're often reluctant to invest in Ukrainian translation because they simply do not see it as a sufficiently feasible investment. The exception may be, of course, the mainstream globally popular content that is likely to attract a large enough audience. Because of that, for example, out of thousands of titles that are available in the Ukrainian Netflix library, less than 200 of them have actually at least some form of Ukrainian translation. So ultimately, we have an issue with insufficient amount and variety of content being provided with official Ukrainian translation. And this is where informal AVT practitioners step in. For example, this issue with availability of content is partly addressed by two informal subtitlers whose nicknames are Erythian and Ivan, and it is their stories I would now like to bring your attention to. Erythian, he has been translating exclusively Norwegian content since 2020. The list of his projects includes mainly fiction titles, with one exception, which is a documentary film. But the reason why he spends his free time outside of his web development job creating subtitles is related not so much to the specific films or series that he translates, but rather to the Norwegian language itself. As Erythian told me in our interview, he fell in love with the language and he ended up completing a Norwegian language course. And while he was still learning the language, he became a frequent visitor to the Ukraine's major torrent file sharing site, which was the only place where he could find some Norwegian content that had informal Ukrainian subtitles in order to aid his learning by watching original content. And at some point, he found himself constantly pointing out translation mistakes made by other informal subtitlers. And as it turned out, the reason there were often many mistakes in the translation was the fact that some of the subtitlers, they would translate from English subtitles rather than from the original Norwegian. And this is how Erythen came to do subtitles himself, because he identified where he could apply his love and knowledge of Norwegian language. So this is the quote from my interview with him. In relation to that, I'll just read it out. Why do I translate Norwegian content? Partly because of the interest in the language and culture, but also because this is where I feel my translation work brings the most value. Firstly, there are more than enough people who can translate from English. And secondly, there is an oversaturation with English language content in the first place. Consequently, even Norwegian films are often translated from English subtitles. This results in a double indirect translation, which in turn reflects negatively on the quality. Translations directly from Norwegian, this is where the gap is. Moreover, I have a wider choice of untranslated content to choose from, because I can translate the titles that were not exported to the English language markets. However, his striving to deliver quality translation, it does not end with the language itself. He has also carefully studied the Netflix subtitling standards, which are called timed text style guide. And he wanted to make sure that the subtitles he creates, they provide a viewer with a pleasant viewing experience. And this recognition of the importance of the subtitles' technical quality, as well as the translation quality, of course, it is echoed in the practices of most other subtitlers that I've interviewed for this research, including Ivan. Ivan has been translating and creating subtitles for Polish content for nearly 10 years now, so his portfolio of works is quite big and rather diverse, but he does tend to prioritize films that were critically acclaimed, that were selected to compete at either Polish or international film festivals. Ivan has similarly followed a subtitling guide to ensure that his subtitles are easily readable, but much like Erythen, he is mostly keen on the linguistic aspect of his practice and not so much on the content itself. And this is how he explains some of the motivations behind his practice. Translating is interesting, fun, and fulfilling. It is a creative practice, a craft. It is a living process where you can bring changes into, improve it, nurture it, put your heart into it. I love challenging myself with translating certain subcultural slang, or rather stuff that may involve advanced niche vocabularies. I think it is this thirst for self-education that doesn't allow me to abandon my hobby. In addition, similar to Erythen, Ivan was critical of translators who, for the sake of saving time and effort, translate not directly from the original, but from another more accessible language. And with this attention to quality and passion for translation, I don't think it's particularly surprising that the quality of his subtitles is rather high. And it's so high, in fact, that his subtitles to one Polish film were once borrowed by a major Ukrainian legal streaming service to create a Ukrainian voiceover for this film. These two cases of Erythen and Ivan, they're good examples of how informal ABT practitioners can expand the diversity of content being available to a specific audience. But what I want to emphasize here is that these cases are rather niche. They're niche not only because of the type of content that is being translated, but because of the specific ABT technique, specifically subtitling, that is being used for translation. Generally, all audiovisual translation techniques, they can be divided into two groups: captioning, such as subtitling, and revoicing, which is dubbing and voiceover. And on the one hand, the preference for one technique over the other, it ultimately comes down to an individual because it results from complex and largely subjective reasons. But it is still valid to say that every country tends to lean towards one of the groups or to a specific technique. For example, we can still define Italy as a traditionally dubbing country or Belgium as a subtitling one. Ukraine is a country with a very clear and long-standing preference for revoicing techniques, specifically for voiceover and for dubbing. Subtitles are only tolerated for very niche content such as Norwegian documentaries or Polish festival films. Even informal subtitlers who I've spoken to who I've interviewed for my research, they've admitted how bizarre subtitles are for an average Ukrainian viewer who would only accept dubbing and voiceover as acceptable translation. And this means that it is not just the availability of translation itself that can include or exclude some markets from the global audience, but also the availability of a specific form of translation. In Ukraine, where both dubbing and voiceover are equally acceptable popular techniques, dubbing is usually reserved for official translations of films that are released in cinemas primarily. And this is because dubbing is technologically more complex. It requires completely removing the original dialogue whilst keeping all the sound effects and soundtracks, and then replacing it with the recorded translated audio track. But the thing is, it is only possible if one has access to the original video file that has all the different audio tracks of a film separately. And unless you are officially cooperating with a production company as a localization studio, you would not be able to get access to that kind of file. Voiceover, on the other hand, it involves simply placing the recorded dialogue on top of the existing audio. And for this reason, it is voiceover that dominates among the informal AVT practices in Ukraine. More specifically, whereas if we compare it with subtitling, whereas in Ukrainian informal subtitling, there are only a handful of individual practitioners for whom this practice is mostly a hobby. When we look at voiceover, this entire informal voiceover practice, it begins to resemble a separate economy in Ukraine that consists of several, around 15 major informal voiceover groups, and that's excluding individual voiceover actors and emerging groups and emerging actors. And this is what I would like to focus my attention on now. But before I give two examples of such groups and how they operate, I should specify that the type of voiceover that is performed by Ukrainian informal practitioners. Because unlike dubbing, voiceover is an umbrella term that covers various techniques that differ based on, for example, how many voices are used in the recording and whether the timings of the original audio track and the translated one match. So when it comes to Ukrainian informal voiceover technique, it is rather similar to so-called simul-sync, which is a type of voiceover that is very, very similar to dubbing. And it has been recently adopted in Italy for non-fiction entertainment television translation. So both of these techniques, the Ukrainian and the Italian one, they involve multiple voices, ideally a distinct voice that matches each key character on screen. Much like in dubbing, voiceover actors imitate the original intonations and just overall acting of the actors on screen. And the Ukrainian voiceover respects isochrony, meaning the translated track has to start and end at the very same time as the original. And finally, the text itself that the voiceover actors read or act out, it is a direct first-person translation, much like in dubbing. And with a few rare exceptions, this type of voiceover is performed by all informal Ukrainian voiceover groups, including two groups called Ether Production and Charm Studio, the two examples which I would now like to draw your attention to. So both of the groups were founded by professionals who are related to the audiovisual translation industry in Ukraine. For example, Ether Production was created by two colleagues who are employed as actors in one of the major theaters in Ukraine, and they also work as dubbing actors for a major Ukrainian localization studio, which is the official, one of the official partners of Netflix, as well as of some Hollywood major studios. Charm Studio, on the other hand, was created by two university graduates who majored in sound editing, sound directing, and one of them is currently working as a dubbing actor as well for another big Ukrainian localization studio. And as a result of such backgrounds, they developed connections with other professionals in the field, including other actors, other graduate actors or emerging actors, specialist translators who specialize in audiovisual translation, and linguists as well. And it is largely these people who were invited and continue to be invited for voiceover projects that this group create. In addition, this background, it provided them with necessary knowledge and skills to sort out proper equipment to be able to produce high quality recording by themselves. Ether Production, for example, they constructed a recording booth in the apartment of one of the founders, where one of the founders of the studio group lived. Charm Studio didn't go that far, but each of the voice actors working within the group would have a proper workspace at home, such as the one you can see on the slide. And furthermore, Charm Studio would often rent an actual recording studio to create their voiceovers. Each voiceover that these groups create is essentially a crowd-funded project. So before starting a project, the groups calculate a small budget, relatively small budget, that would be required to cover the costs of a voiceover production. For Charm Studio, for example, that would normally be the rent of a recording studio and a small fee for the work of a translator that they would hire for a specific project. Ether Production, then very well known in Ukraine to invite very famous voice actors and translators for their projects. And these actors and translators, they know very well that in this case, they're working for an informal crowd-funded project. And for that reason, they're happy to work at a very, very reduced rate. So what I should emphasize here that this budget never includes any profits for the group, meaning the practices that I'm talking about, they are non-profit, although they do involve some money. So this budget is then presented to the public, and anyone who wishes to donate to the project is welcome to do so. The choice of the projects, which titles to translate, which series, which films, is normally based on either one of the two factors. It's either IMDb rating of a film or a series, or audience's requests. And the latter means that a lot of people begin contacting a group saying that they would really want to be able to watch the show or this film in Ukrainian, but unfortunately it's unavailable anywhere. So both of these factors, they serve essentially as indicators for the group that this is where they're, thank you, this is where their work is much needed, and they can make a valuable contribution to improving the linguistic accessibility of the content. So once the groups are at least halfway through with raising the necessary funds, they can begin their voiceover work. Most groups, including the two that I've presented here, they follow a relatively similar process, which can very briefly be described like this. So firstly, the original text is translated into Ukrainian in the form of subtitles. Translators, they essentially create a karaoke-like script that the voiceover actors then use during the recording. Then if a group decides not to rent a studio, then the video file with the subtitles is distributed among all the participating actors, who then record their part at home using their own equipment and own software. If a group decides to use a studio, as Ether Production does, then the participating actors are invited one by one to the studio to record their lines. And after all voices are recorded, one of the group's founders, who usually coordinates the entire project, he puts all these tracks together. In other words, they do sound mix and sound editing until they have the final voiced over film or episode. And the last stage is obviously releasing this translated content for people to enjoy for free. Audiences can either download it from a file sharing site or stream it online from a pirate streaming sites, which are very popular and accessible in Ukraine. Right, so this is, of course, a very brief description of this group and their practices, and there are so many more nuances and interesting cases and aspects of these practices that can help better understand their nature in full. And I explore more of them in my PhD research, but what I hope I managed to demonstrate today is how diverse, complex, and far from amateur informal AVT practices can be. Because if it wasn't for these practices, Ukrainian-speaking viewers would not be able to watch any of these and many, many other films and series, and they would thus be excluded from the global audience which they equally deserve to be part of. So, conscious of time, I'm going to wrap up here. Here's the reference list for this talk. Thank you very much for listening. I really look forward to the next paper.
Thank you very much, Kateryna. Another really interesting paper there, and I am also looking forward to the Q&A. I'm sure there'll be lots to pick up on there across papers and from the audience. Right, conscious of time as well, we're going to move right along to Xiao Yao, who goes by Yu. Are you ready to load the slides back up, Yu, while I introduce you? You hold a BA in Tourism Management and English from Beijing International Studies University, a minor degree in French, and an MA in Translation and Bilingual Communications from Hong Kong Baptist University. And I believe currently, correct me if I'm wrong, working on a PhD at Hong Kong University. Hope I've got that right anyway. So whenever you're ready, over to you, Yu.
Okay, hello everyone. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, let's start. Hello everyone. My research is about the transnational fandom's participation in cross-cultural introduction of Loki. The main series I will use in my research is based on the media series by Henry Jenkins. For example, the most important concept fandom, which means the fans with same identity and common culture. Besides, Henry Jenkins put forward the concept textual culture, which means the consumers intrude in the text, compete for ownership and control over it with the author. They appropriate useful resources for them and create by themselves. Henry Jenkins Henry Jenkins says that fans integrate media representation with the society and life experience. They challenge the dominant cultural hierarchy and author's authority, which means the unity of media acceptance and elaboration and the combination of author and consumers. He means that the fandom shows sharing, communication, and interaction with each other. Based on the concept of fandom, the two scholars put forward concept forensic fandom, which means the fans dig deeper, understand complexity of a story and its telling. They drill down and to discover more. Besides, they rediscover the stories they encountered previously, which is of course criticism's aim. Besides, they may spark an interest, causing a viewer to work independently or viewers to work collectively to learn more about a topic.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm just checking you're not trying to move the slide. The slides aren't moving along, in case you've been trying to move the slides along. I just wanted to make you aware of that.
Do you mean the?
Okay, continue. Sorry.
Okay. I'm sorry.
Which slide are you trying to be on at the moment?
Yes, this slide, key selection. Can you see the slide?
See it now. It just wasn't changing on our screen between one slide to another, but it's working now if you're on slide number 4.
No, I can play the slide now.
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Okay. No interruption.
As for the case I will use the TV series Loki, which is from the MCU in 2021. Because first of all, the MCU enjoys high brand reputation across the world, and its unique creative feature of transmedia storytelling makes it enjoys high value for our research. As for the TV series Loki, it connects previous works with the upcoming fourth stage of the MCU, and it opens a new theme of the multiverse. As for the video remix, it is most attractive for the Chinese fans. However, it has not enjoyed enough attention from the scholars. So I think I will pay attention to the remixed videos by Chinese fans in the cross-cultural introduction of the TV series. As for the media platform, I will pay attention to the Bilibili, which is the most popular platform for video release in China. And I will concentrate on the uploader with most followers and largest number of watching. As for the keys, first of all, I will pay attention to the speech pattern of the uploader, 大葱看电影. As you can see, the Chinese words on the screen is all the most famous cyber words for the Chinese netizens. The uploaders combines the value of the contents of combines the text with the cyber language in China and follows the pace of linguistic growth in China, which means his target text most attractive for the Chinese netizens. Besides, he refers to the pictures, memes, GIFs, and shorts from other movies in the cross-cultural introduction of the TV series and to show his own attitude towards the plot. For example, he uses this picture to talk about the decorative style in the TV series.
I'm sorry to interrupt again. It's just not changing the slides. If you could just click on each slide in the side menu when you change it, I think that will probably work.
Okay. Okay.
But it's not. Something's wrong with the PowerPoint in terms of moving it along. So that is on the one with Joker now. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, just click in the side menu when you need to change the slide, and I will just check with me that it's changed. Sorry about that.
As for the two pictures, you can see the shots from the movie Joker and the other movie from the Chinese movie. The uploader uses the two pictures to show his attitude towards the plot. And the two memes also used to show his attitude towards the content. As for the translation of the TV series, he published his target text after the release of each episode. For example, he explains the plot of each episode. He talks about the details, especially the hidden information from the details. For example, the music, props, decorations, and furnishings in the TV series. And he also analyzes important plot and shows his own attitude, and even discusses the dialogue between characters with Socratism and the Bible. We can see that his self-attitude, consciousness, and the knowledge reserve all affect the message delivery and emotions delivery of the TV series. Besides, he published a watching preview before the first episode to review the stories of the previous movie and guess what will happen in the new story. And he also predicts destiny of characters, story trend, and villain in each episode. And he even summarized and shows his self-standpoints about prospects and MCU's fourth stage. We can see that his self-consciousness and great initiative in the translation of the TV series and the media context. Besides, he talks about the connection between the MCU movies and the Loki, and he talks about the new theme about multiverse and shows his self-attitude. He even analyzes the logo, characters, and classicalizes the opening of each episode, especially the information from them. For example, he talks about the famous roles and organizations from MCU and Marvel Comics in the TV series and show what the organizations and the famous roles means in the TV series, and reappearance of props and locales, and reproduction of previous scenes and shots in the TV series, and especially analyze the implications of them. Besides, he released the videos on Bilibili, Weibo, YouTube, and WeChat official account at the same times. He uses the multiple media platforms to attract the most audience to see his target test. And he also opens a vote about the choice question on time paradox and about the identity of the final boss to discuss with the audience. For example, this is the choice question in the TV series. The uploader uses it to discuss with his audience to talk about the information of the TV series. For example, this is the vote about the villain. We can see that the choice of the majority fans equals with the actual development of the plot. They choose the Time Garden Kong, which is the actual boss of the TV series. At last, I would like to talk about the value and sustainable development of translational fandom. We can see that the engagement about the engagement by the translational fandom is quite valuable for the message delivery, especially the emotions of the TV series and its cultural infection and aesthetic and artistic charm. Besides, it is quite valuable for investment and loyalty from audiences. For the fan himself, it's quite profit for his information harvest and enhance of his individual cognitive level. Besides, through the discussion and cooperation by fans, they can get dominance, independence, and autonomy, initiative in test production and circulation. They can show their shared stance, common identity, and cultural status in the test production and test narration. For the Marvel brand, the engagement by fans is quite important for the brand reputation and cultural gene and core values, and propagation and innovation artistic ideas and techniques, especially to talk about the Marvel elements in the TV series. Besides, the uploader uses multiple platforms to release his remix the videos. Means that it's quite valuable for the convergence and revolution in media industry and platforms, and is quite important for the progress in creative methods, propositions on film and TV art in China, and even the reform in popular culture and social ideology. As for the sustainable development of translational fandom, I think the most important one is the quality of target test. The fans should pay attention to the quality of the target test, and especially the frequency of update. And they should take serious and responsible attitude to avoid unnecessary mistakes. Besides, they should use multiple modes of participation. Maybe they should pay attention to the cultural connotations, ideological intentions, and emotional purposes. I think the fans, especially the uploader we talk about in the he did not show much attention in the cultural connotations and emotional purposes of the test. Besides, they can talk about the bonds of the text with life experience, personal cognition and stance, popular culture, and outstanding phenomena and hot issues, and social consciousness. However, the fans has not shown much attention and engagement in this prospect. Besides, they should use multiple platforms for their translation engagement and use open, diverse channels for communication to open the abundant ways of interaction. Besides, they should treat the different views and criticisms rationally and give proper and prompt reactions for their audiences. To establish benign environment for dialogues and cooperations and expressions and creations in the translation practice. Besides, they should try their best to attract a wide range of fans, encourage more fan involvement and investment, especially attention from non-fan groups. Besides, they should negotiate with professional translators and try to keep a balance between conventional pursuit of faithfulness and translators' more autonomy and initiative to break through the marginal status of the fan translators and build up systematic and effective strategies for AVT. Thank you so much.
Right, thank you very much. We've come in a little under time there, so maybe we could expand upon some of that in the Q&A, hopefully, Yu. But thank you very much for that paper. Sorry about the technical issues. Okay, so we have around 25 minutes, I think, for a Q&A. If you are able in the audience and willing to turn the camera on and give the participants some sense of their audience, again, that would be fantastic. Hi, Elka. And if you have a question, please pop your hand up or feel free to use the chat as well, and I will monitor that and read out any questions that go in there. Does anyone have a question that they would like to kick off. And please feel free, the participants, to ask each other questions. There's a lot of connections here, I feel, between some of the practices, also some of the platforms in different contexts, from America to the Chinese market. Lynn, you have your hand up. I think that's been up for a while. Is that still a a mistake, or did you want to ask a question? I'm going to assume that the hand was a mistake. Does anyone else want to kick off with a question, or shall I break the ice? Well, I actually thought it was really interesting how a couple of things stood out there as far as issues of affect, I thought were quite prominent, and how they sort of dialogue with issues of access. Those are the two kind of words that I was jotting down there across these two papers, and how they map onto these formal and informal ideas, roots about distribution and practices. But in many cases, it seems like fans, and I don't know, we were talking before, Kateryna, about whether or not we're using the term fans for this. Maybe you could speak to this a little bit, but certainly audiences, people outside of the formal processes of distribution, platform organizations, certainly
Cody, you're causing us feedback. Can you switch your microphone off again quickly? Sorry.
I've just muted Cody for 1 second.
Okay, great.
Okay, yeah, in many ways it's fans, audiences performing some kind of labor, I think, for these industries, for platforms like Disney or Netflix, or for, you know, Marvel, who don't necessarily have full access to the Chinese market with Disney Plus. So my question, very long-winded way of coming around to that, is like, to what extent in your different contexts that you're looking at, do you think the industry might or is even able to embrace these informal practices as part of their processes of building access around the globe? To what extent should we, or should the industry be kind of just letting this happen informally to their benefit, or what point should we be bringing this labor into how the actual industry works? I don't know. I hope that question makes sense. It's kind of it was kind of half formed as I was saying it, but I don't know if either Cody, you or Kateryna has any burning response to that. So who wants to take that on?
I'll go ahead and give it a try.
Yeah.
I am a little confused about some of the things, but as far as the context and what I think the industry is doing, there definitely are things that the big thing right now with direct to streaming is getting more live entertainment on direct to streaming services. So I think that's a really important and interesting thing, that more and more of these brands, of these companies are trying to do that. And I think they're trying to do that to compete with terrestrial television, because all of these studios and all of these companies realize that this is, I mean, it's the present, but it's also going to be much of the future. And another thing that I think is really important with live entertainment is you're seeing a lot of these companies now, I guess to bring in my sport background, my sport marketing background, you're seeing a lot of these companies now bidding over trying to have live sports entertainment. So not just tape delayed, and not just the weekly game that you have, like there's a weekly Major League Baseball game on YouTube, and I know YouTube carries leagues around the world on a weekly basis. But you're actually having where Disney, who owns ESPN, is going to be able to show the NFL Super Bowl. And part of that agreement is they're going to be able to show it on streaming services. So they're going to show it on both terrestrial and streaming service when it's their time to show. And yesterday in the United States, a lot of people know college athletics is such a big deal here. Pac-12 conference, University of Southern California and UCLA, actually announced that they're leaving the Pac-12 and they're going to the Big Ten conference. And what's interesting about that is this morning before we met, I actually just read an article about now Apple TV or Apple is in on bidding for Big Ten games again. They had previously kind of dropped out. They weren't really serious about it. Now they're back in. And I think there's a lot of things that these companies are doing to try and get more entertainment on there, more live entertainment, to try to get more people listening or watching that maybe aren't right now.
Yeah, that was, and the question was deliberately broad to try and take in all these different aspects, but that's kind of what I was thinking is it a case that sport is uniquely channels this kind of rivalry mentality, this affect that is very much bound up with loyalty to a brand? Does that translate into more sport, which is obviously a thing they're looking at? So that's really interesting as a response. Yeah. Kateryna, did you want to pick?
I'll pick up on that. I've written down a few points as a response. They're a bit messy, but I'll try to put them all together. So yes, essentially the practices that I am looking at, they're doing the job that the formal industry is supposed to do, but it doesn't. And by formal industry, I refer both to the global content distributors as well as Ukrainian broadcasters or Ukrainian national streaming services that they often don't buy enough content, because if they buy content, they have to localize it. It's a typical economic problem of not wishing to spend too much money on something they might not be able to get the return of investment on, especially in a country such as Ukraine, where there is a long-formed lack of culture to pay for content, because lots of media, it used to be state-owned and it provided content for free. And now with the emergence of streaming services and more sort of adoption of this global distribution and paying for content model, you have to basically change the way you viewed your ability to access content as a Ukrainian. That's one part of that. But of course, this is changing now. So even Netflix is increasing the amount of content that's being available in Ukrainian, and it's not just about the new Netflix releases, but also the older ones. So as an example, I wanted to give Stranger Things. They've originally, when they were just released on Netflix, and it is a Netflix original, it wasn't provided with any translation. I think after season 2 or 3, they started adding Ukrainian subtitles officially on Netflix. But at the same time, one of the voiceover groups in Ukraine, informal ones, they've already created voiceover for the series. And now, last year, Netflix has finally created dubbing, official one, for all the previous Stranger Things episodes. So now if you go to an unofficial streaming service in Ukraine, for example, you will find various options of translation, whichever you prefer, voiceover, subtitles, and dubbing. But this change, I should probably mention the case why this change has happened. In 2017 and then repeatedly in 2019, 2020, Ukrainian people, they've created a petition to Netflix and Amazon Prime asking to provide them with linguistic access to the content, to start adding at least subtitles, but ideally voiceover or dubbing, to be able to watch content that those services ask Ukrainians to pay for, the same price as they ask for audiences for whom they provide this linguistic access. And this petition, that it reached over 90,000 of signatures, and it was at the end signed, responded to by the president of Ukraine. That's how serious and large the issue is, who promised to start negotiating providing translation. And this ties back to the last point that I would like to mention in relation to this question, is just generally the lack of regulation of such relatively new distribution models as streaming services, because Netflix and Amazon Prime, they don't always tend to officially enter the market as a company and operate following all the laws of that market that they enter in. And for that reason, Ukrainian formal streaming services, they actually said that Netflix is no is not much different to other pirates that they're trying to fight with, because they Netflix also doesn't have to follow the regulation when it comes to language. So any officially registered distribution company in Ukraine, they are obliged by law to provide Ukrainian localization in the form of voiceover or dubbing. Because Netflix didn't enter Ukraine officially as a company, it's available from your computer, but as a company it's not available, so they don't have to comply with this regulation. So there is a whole entire story there with and it's not just the case in Ukraine. There are many other European countries where this is happening, where Netflix is sort of formal and official, but for national content distributors it's a big rival, because it's not as restricted by national regulations as the national distributors are. Right.
Yeah, so it's sort of like your work is highlighting that the boundary between formal and informal processes becoming blurred, even with something we are tempted to consider like the height of formal distribution in Netflix, because we're all studying it, we're all taking it seriously as the official globalized broadcaster. But that's really interesting. Yeah. Yu, did you have any? Did you want to talk a little bit more about the Chinese market and Disney's place within the Chinese market in relation to these kind of fan practices that you're talking about?
Yes, because in China, because of the copyright restrictions, maybe the audience may find it difficult to watch the Marvel TV movies or movies and TV series on the website. So the fans or the uploaders on the Bilibili and other media platforms, they remix the original videos and add the voiceovers and self-attitude towards the plot and explains the plot. Maybe they will predict what will happen in the story, and we will talk about the final boss to make the more audience know about the TV series and know about what happens in the TV show. However, they may not receive great popularity because the videos made by the fans only watched by the audience of the Marvel, but however without much attention from other people, for example the other netizens. So I think I would like to talk about the sustainable development of transnational fandom for the Marvel, for example. So I think the most important thing for the uploaders and the fan translators, they should try to attract more attention from the other fans and audiences, especially the non-fan groups, to increase the popularity of their target test and for even the popularity of the Marvel brand and the TV series. Besides, I think they should try to establish a healthy environment for dialogue and cooperation between fans in China, to face the regulation, political regulation of the Chinese government and the regulation from the internet, the internet regulation, for example.
So it's sort of going beyond the idea of directly entering a market and branding and marketing in this informal process that then sort of opens up a space, opens up a demand, a visible demand that then can signal to governments, like Kateryna was saying, but also to these international players. The similar processes go on there, I think. Really interesting way.
Because the most audiences, they cannot watch the whole TV series but on the internet, so they can just rely on the remixed video by the fans. However, they cannot attract much popularity in China. So I think it's really difficult for them.
Yeah. Elke, you got your hand up.
Yes, very unapologetically, I'm asking one question directly at Kateryna. I was really struck by that phrase you used where you basically emphasized that some of the motivation comes out of a linguistic fandom. And I just wanted to see if you could expand on that a little bit. I found that really, really interesting, because normally when we think of fandom, obviously we think of programs or series or something like that, but linguistic fandom sounds really interesting.
Yeah, that's just generally an interesting point about this practice, and I was quite fascinated to find out that this does not happen in many other countries, where all these practices, they do remind us of fandom, like subtitling or voiceover, but they're not related to fandom, especially voiceover practices. I will return to subtitling and linguists, but yeah, I think that's a very important point to mention, that they are not fans of the content that they create, because they're fans of the art of voiceover. They are professionals, like dancers love to dance, no matter whether they do it for money or for not. Like songwriters love to write songs, no matter whether they end up being professional songwriters or it will be just their hobby. And same here, really. What I have noticed with subtitlers is that yes, for them it's primarily their interest in learning the language that was the reason it's the reason they're watching something with subtitles rather than voiceover and dubbing. That subtitles in Ukraine is a very, very niche audiovisual translation practice that is only used by those people who wish to learn the language. And I've noticed the same with translators who work with voiceover studios, because they also create subtitles. They don't just translate the text and lines on paper, they create subtitles. Yes, it's all directly to language, really. And subtitling just happens to be a form the most convenient for them to work with. It's almost coincidental, really. But primarily they are linguists. They are graduates of universities with a linguistic sort of background, and they look for ways where else can they apply their language skills apart from teaching a language or being a translator elsewhere. And yeah, I hope that answers the question, but yes, it's quite good. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting as well, in terms of like what TV is assumed to be able to travel well, and in linguistic terms, it's often assumed that like things that the barrier is low. It will be easier when the specific cultural tics of language and culture are minimized. Whereas when you talked about Ivan, I think I wrote down, like talking about relishing the challenge of like picking up really specific cultural things, that encourages a certain type of television to travel that is actually a lot more culturally specific in the Norwegian or the Polish TV that's traveling. So it's like it almost goes against the logics of what travels well, because you've got these linguists who really want complex stuff to move across borders. There's not really a question. It's more
No, it is true, and it's quite fascinating, because I have had a few interviews where I just have like 3 pages of people explaining how passionate they are, of how much they spend almost a month trying to translate some term it's not an actual term, it was just a like a funny combination of words that were put together in that specific context, so you wouldn't find this word in a dictionary, and the person really wanted to make sure that they can translate this combined word into Ukrainian, but it implied Lucas. So they spent months looking for a translation for it, and they did not really care how many people are going to watch their subtitles, because they know it's not a particularly popular practice, and many complained that audiences, when they release a subtitled film or show, they receive a lot of questions. I'm sorry, is there going to be a normal translation? And by normal translation, I mean voiceover or dubbing. And the response from a subtitle isn't, but yes. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's sort of it's very much in line with the idea of translational fandom as well, I think, that you use talking about there. I had a question for, please do put your hand up if you have any questions from the audience as well. I had a question for Cody on the idea of a rival in the design, and more of a methodological question, the idea of asking streaming fans who their rival streaming platform is. Was there any kind of friction there, as in like, did everyone have a rival or perception of rival? How did you phrase the question in order to kind of get that response of a rival? Because I think it's really interesting, so much of TV positioning of themselves is against something. So we're familiar with like the HBO positioning themselves against the rest of TV, regular broadcast TV, or BBC now having to position themselves against Netflix. Was there always a rival in mind when you ask people about their streaming fandom?
So thanks for that. What's interesting about this is when we do all of these comparison studies, because we design for the sport context and asking who's your favorite team, who's your rival team, in various other settings, we have actually pitted two brands against each other. So then it's kind of an a priori rivalry. So for instance, in politics in the United States, it's pretty easy to say, are you consider yourself a Democrat or Republican or an independent? And actually in that study, nobody said they considered themselves an independent. So we had, two brands. In the streaming, in this study, we wanted to kind of leave it open so we could we could clean it up on the back end. And since these are quantitative, like, we ask an open-ended question: why do you consider this your rival? And some of it is, I think, because of parent companies. So like Disney and Comcast are pretty big corporate rivals. So that would mean Disney Plus, Hulu, and then Peacock might be rivals of each other. Now, also, I think what could be at play here is you saw the most number of the rival brand was Netflix and Disney Plus. I think because those are the two that have the most subscribers, especially when you consider Disney Plus plus Hulu, that I'm not sure there has always been a rivalry in amongst certain companies, but I think everybody's out to get Netflix because Netflix was the original interrupter, and actually was the reason that a lot of the studios got together to create Hulu to be a competitor with Netflix. So I think a lot of these studios that are launching these services see Netflix as one. They were the original interrupter, and then two, or disruptor, sorry, and then two, they have the largest market share. So in rivalry, what you're going to do is you typically want to go for someone who's above you. Now, it doesn't really help to go for someone who, like, let's say in the sport context, if you're the last place team, you don't want to say the first place team's your rival because they're the competitive disadvantage there. But you want to go for somebody who's either on your level or above. So I think all of these companies now are seeing themselves trying to compete with Netflix. And then because of the success of Disney Plus, and I think you have to bring up the pandemic and its impact on streaming, and especially Disney Plus having launched right before massive lockdown started. I think those two companies are seen as companies people want to compete with and people want to reach. Now, another thing I think is interesting is with that Hulu brand, because a lot of these studios like CBS, who has Paramount Plus, Disney, a lot of them got together to create Hulu because Netflix was such a disruptor to the market. So I think that's probably where it lies. There weren't people that really got into that much of it, but just looking at responses and talking with people, we're starting to do a qualitative study about this as well. That seems to be what it is that Netflix and Disney Plus are those top because they have the market share. And then I kind of think everybody sees Amazon Prime as just, it has huge market share, but I'm not sure the programming is there the same way as it is on Netflix. So I think that could be a reason why that's a second or third rival for people.
Yeah, and you mentioned obviously that you did this before Netflix's kind of shares dropped and they lost a lot of the market. So it'd be interesting to see what kind of manufactured rivalries emerge as that shifts around a little bit. But it's also interesting, just to tie it back to the others, I feel like you're dealing very much in a US context there. And as we saw from Kateryna's presentation the other day and the other presentations here, these have very specific manifestations in other national markets as well, that some of these presentations I think really do sort of shine a light on, and you can put these ideas of rivalries together into those other contexts. There's a lot to work with here, I suppose, is what I'm saying. Is any, I think we're out of time pretty much. Is there any final questions anyone wants to ask before I close up? Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Would everyone show your appreciation either through the emojis or otherwise for our presenters? I really enjoyed all of those panels. We are back in half an hour, I think, Elke, is that right? 3 o'clock, Elke will be back with another panel on fandom. Do you have anything you want to announce before we wrap up?
No, just to say at 3 o'clock, yes.
Yes, 3 o'clock. We'll see you all there, hopefully. And thank you again to Cody, Kateryna, and you.